What happens when the dream of a peaceful suburban life crashes headfirst into a chilling reality? When community rules aren't about shared values, but about unseen battles for control, veiled in polite smiles and official notices? At Deepu Cater Stories, we're about to tell you the story of Marcus Thorne in Sunny Creek, a man who simply wanted to fish. But because Marcus was black, his simple act was deemed unauthorized. He fought back. He exposed the truth. He won. But that's when the real story began. Because the HOA, unable to control him, decided to ban every single resident from the lake. For his victory, this isn't just a story about fines and bylaws. It's about the quiet power of prejudice and the high price of truth. Part 1. The Notice. It began, as these things often do, with a piece of paper, not in a mailbox, but nailed to the old oak tree at the center of the Sunny Creek Estates Community Board. The paper was crisp, white, official. It announced that Serenity Lake, the heart of their neighborhood, was now closed, indefinitely. The words were simple: liability issues, insurance protocols, a decision made for the safety of all residents. Below the typed text was a signature, neat and sharp, a familiar sight in Sunny Creek. Eleanor Vance, HOA board president. For most residents who gathered there on that gray Monday morning, it was an outrage, a mystery, a sudden theft of their shared peace. The Millers stood in stunned silence. Mr. Kowalski, who walked the lake path every single morning, just shook his head. But for Marcus Thorne, it was just the end of a story that had started 6 weeks earlier, on a Saturday morning that felt like a lifetime ago. A story that began not with a notice, but with a fishing line cutting through the still water. 6 weeks earlier, the sun was warm on Marcus Thorne's shoulders. He was a retired history teacher, a man who found comfort in quiet patterns. The rhythmic cast of his fishing rod, the gentle tug on the line, the calm of Serenity Lake. This ritual was more than a hobby. It was a conversation with his late father, who had taught him how to fish on a lake much like this one. On chilly mornings in 1978, it was peace. Then, a sound, not the sound of nature, but the soft, electric hum of a golf cart rolling to a stop on the gravel path behind him. Marcus didn't need to turn. He knew the sound. He knew the shadow that now fell over him. Eleanor Vance stood there. She was a woman carved from the very foundations of Sunny Creek. Her family had been among the first to build here. Her posture was perfect. Her blonde hair, immaculate. She saw the neighborhood not as a collection of homes, but as a legacy to be protected from change, from disorder, from anything that did not fit her precise vision of community. She didn't raise her voice. She never did. Her power was in her calm, unwavering tone. "Good morning," she said. The words were pleasant. The meaning was not. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Eleanor Vance." Marcus reeled in his line. Slowly, the water rippled. "Marcus Thorne. I live over on Willow Lane." Eleanor smiled, a thin, tight smile that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Thorne, it seems you may not be familiar with our community standards. This area requires prior authorization for recreational activities." Marcus kept his voice even, measured. "I have my state fishing license right here. Mrs. Vance." She waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away a fly. "State licenses are for state lands. This is Sunny Creek." She pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from the pocket of her pristine blazer. A pen clicked. The sound was unnervingly loud in the morning quiet. She began to write. "What exactly is the violation?" Marcus asked. His voice was calm, but a familiar weight was settling in his chest. The weight of having to explain his own existence. "Bylaw 12, Eleanor stated, not looking up from her pad. "Section C. Unauthorized use of common amenities." Marcus looked out at the empty lake. He was the only one there. "Unauthorized? Indeed," she said. She tore the slip of paper from the notebook. The sound ripped through the quiet air. She held it out to him. On the paper was a number. $250. A fine. Marcus looked from the paper to her face. He saw no room for discussion, no space for reason. He saw only the cold, hard certainty of a rule. He asked one last question, his voice barely a whisper. Which rule? Exactly. Did I break? Eleanor finally looked at him. Her eyes were pale blue, unblinking, the one that says you need to ask first. She turned, stepped back onto her golf cart, and drove away. The electric hum faded, leaving Marcus alone, with the sun, the water, and a piece of paper in his hand. He looked back at the notice on the community board, the memory fading as the gray Monday morning came back into focus. The crowd was starting to thin, muttering in frustration as they walked back to their homes. The notice said the lake was closed. For winning, Marcus Thorne knew the truth. It was closed because he had dared to ask a simple question. It was closed because he had decided, in that quiet moment 6 weeks ago, that he would not just pay the fine. He would find the history of the rule, and he would learn, for himself, who truly had the authority to write it. The fight had not started today, with this notice. It had started then, with that fine, with a question, with a quiet, unyielding refusal to simply obey. Part 2. The weight of a fine. Back inside his study, Marcus placed the slip of paper on his desk. It sat beside a faded photograph from 1982. A picture of his father, a proud man holding a large bass caught in a lake just north of Tallahassee. $250. The amount was an annoyance. Nothing more. A single trip to the grocery store could cost as much. But the words, unauthorized use, that was the part that stuck, like a burr under the skin. Unauthorized by whom? By what authority? He wasn't a guest here. He wasn't a trespasser. He was a homeowner. His name clearly printed on the deed filed with the county. He had paid his dues. A check mailed promptly on the first of every month. He had followed the state's laws. The fishing license tucked safely in his wallet. Yet, in the eyes of Eleanor Vance, his quiet presence had been a violation, a disruption, an unauthorized event. He wrestled with the urge to just write the check, to make the problem disappear and return to the quiet life he had sought in Sunny Creek. It would be easier, simpler, but his entire life had been spent studying history, understanding how small moments of unchallenged authority, a decree from a distant king, a tax imposed without representation, a rule enforced without reason could grow into larger systems of control. To pay the fine felt like agreeing with the premise. It felt like validating the cool, dismissive look in her eyes. It felt like defeat. He pushed the checkbook away. Later that afternoon, the Florida sun casting long shadows across his lawn, he went into his backyard to prune the rose bushes his wife had planted before she passed. He heard the intermittent sound of a power drill from next door. Javi Rojas, his new neighbor, was fixing a loose panel on his fence. Javi was in his early 30s, a software engineer with a friendly, open face and an easy smile. He and his wife, Maria, represented a new wave in Sunny Creek. Younger families moving in for the good schools and quiet streets. Unaware of the unspoken rules that governed the manicured lawns, Javi switched off the drill and wiped sweat from his brow. Hey, Marcus, it's a hot one. Catch anything this morning? Marcus managed a wry smile. Clipping a dead bloom from a rose bush, he hesitated for a moment, the fine feeling like a private embarrassment. Then he decided to speak. I caught a fine. Javi's expression didn't show surprise. It showed instant, weary recognition. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Ah, so you've officially been welcomed to the Eleanor Club. He leaned against the fence, his tool resting at his feet. Let me guess. Something about community standards? The shared understanding was a small relief. Marcus recounted the morning's encounter, keeping his tone neutral, like a historian reporting facts. When he finished, Javi just nodded slowly. Last month, Javi said, his voice dropping a little, we got a $50 fine. My daughter's bicycle. She's 6. She left it on the lawn overnight after playing with her friends. The email cited a rule about yard clutter. He gestured with his thumb toward his garden path, which was lined with small, whimsical solar lights shaped like mushrooms. The month before that, a warning. These lights, Maria loves them, but apparently, their soft white glow is not in keeping with the neighborhood's established aesthetic. He wasn't angry. He sounded tired, resigned. It was the sound of a man who had chosen his battles and decided these weren't worth fighting. It's not just us, he continued. The Chens. Down the street, they had to submit architectural plans, drawn up by a professional, for their kid's playset. A playset. Mrs. Henderson. The sweet old lady on the corner who gives out the best Halloween candy, fined for planting 2 tomato plants in her front flower bed. They were non-approved flora. Javi lowered his voice further, though there was no one else around. She acts like she owns the place. I tried looking up the bylaws on the HOA website once. It's a mess. 100 pages of legal jargon. Vague. It's almost like she makes up the rules as she goes. That last sentence landed with the force of a revelation in Marcus's mind. It crystallized the uneasy feeling he'd had all day. She makes up the rules. This was no longer about a fishing fine. This was about the very legitimacy of the system Eleanor presided over. It was about the foundation. Was it built on solid rock? Or just on years of unquestioned habit? Marcus looked at his neighbor, a new sense of purpose solidifying within him. Chasing away the weariness. Javi, he asked, his voice quiet but firm. How good are you at finding things online, official things, public records? Javi grinned, a spark of mischief finally lighting up his tired eyes. Marcus, that's what I do for a living. And just like that, an alliance was formed over a shared wooden fence. The objective had changed. It wasn't about fighting a fine anymore. It was about auditing a queen. Part 3. The Ghost in the Archives. Javi's living room. Typically a chaotic landscape of children's toys and comfortable furniture, became their command center. His laptop sat open on the coffee table, a web of browser tabs spreading across the screen like a digital detective's map. County tax record, geographic information system maps with their intricate, colorful layers. Property deeds dating back decades. Marcus sat beside him in a worn armchair, a legal pad on his lap, making notes, guiding the search with the quiet, methodical instincts of a historian. He asked questions Javi hadn't thought to ask. Not just who pays the taxes now, but who paid them first. Not just what are the boundaries, but who drew them. But after 2 evenings of digging, they hit a wall. Every modern digital record they found listed the Sunny Creek Homeowners Association as the managing entity for the common areas, including the lake. The documents were clear on management. They were frustratingly silent on original ownership. It was a dead end. A perfect loop of bureaucratic language that explained nothing and confirmed everything Eleanor believed. Javi leaned back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. It's like the information just isn't there. It all points back to the HOA, but never says how it got there. Marcus stared at the screen, but his mind was elsewhere, sifting through decades of experience. We're looking at what is, he said softly, more to himself than to Javi. We need to look at what was. He explained his thinking. Legal entities evolve. Management agreements change. Bylaws are amended. But the founding documents, those were like a constitution. They were the origin story. Unchanging. The answer isn't on a server. Javi, Marcus concluded, a new conviction in his voice. It's on paper. In a box. Somewhere. The next day, Marcus drove to the county records office, a formidable brick building downtown. The air inside smelled of old paper, binding glue, and quiet dignity. Behind a tall, polished counter sat a woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, a woman in her late 60s who had worked there for over 40 years. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her glasses hung from a chain around her neck. She was the keeper of the county's memories, and she did not suffer fools gladly. Marcus approached her not with a demand, but with a historian's respect for an archivist. He explained he was a retired history teacher, researching the development of his neighborhood. Sunny Creek Estates, for a personal project. He didn't mention the HOA. He didn't mention the fine. He just spoke of history, of wanting to understand the intentions of the original builders. Mrs. Rodriguez's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. She saw not a troublemaker demanding a file, but a fellow guardian of the past. She nodded once, then led him to a rolling shelf in the climate-controlled back room, pulling out several dusty, cardboard boxes labeled Sunny Creek Development, 1971 through 1975, for hours. Marcus sat at a long, empty wooden table, the only sound the soft rustle of aging paper. He carefully turned brittle pages, his fingers tracing the lines of blueprints, zoning permits, an old sales contract, and then, deep inside a thin file folder simply marked Common Utilities. He found it. It wasn't flashy. It was just a few typewritten pages, stapled together in the top left corner. It was a document titled The Serenity Lake Community Trust Agreement, dated 1972. His breath caught in his throat. He read the dense text, his finger tracing the words as if they were written in a foreign language he was slowly deciphering. The language was formal, archaic, full of heretofores and whereases, but the meaning was crystal clear. The developer, referred to as the grantor, had transferred the ownership of the lake and its surrounding parkland not to the homeowners association, but into an irrevocable trust, a trust created for the sole benefit and enjoyment of all present and future property owners of Sunny Creek Estates. The owners were named the beneficiaries, and the HOA, Marcus scanned the document until he found the name. They were named the trustee. Their only duty, outlined in precise, unforgiving legal terms, was to maintain and preserve the property. They were janitors, not kings. Marcus sat back in the creaking wooden chair, the silence of the archive room ringing in his ears, louder than any alarm. The fines, the rules, the warnings, all of it was built on a lie told so many times, for so many years, that it had become the truth. He hadn't just found a loophole. He had found the forgotten constitution of his own community. He had found the ghost in the archives. In the silence of the past, Marcus had found a truth with the power to change the present. It was a moment where a single piece of old paper could unravel an empire built on habit and forgetting. We believe that everyone here has a story about discovering a hidden truth, big or small. Please, share your story in the comments below. And now, let's return to Marcus, as he decides what to do with the powerful weapon he has just found. Part 4, The Whispering Campaign. Back in Javi's garage, the scent of sawdust and motor oil mingled with the low hum of a scanner printer. Marcus laid the original trust agreement, carefully enclosed in a protective sleeve, on the workbench. Javi was making several high-quality copies. If we confront her at the next HOA meeting, Marcus said, his voice low and strategic, his words measured, she'll turn it into a personal attack. Me versus her. She'll paint me as a disgruntled resident with a grudge over a fishing fine. We need this to be a community truth before it ever becomes a public fight. Javi looked up from the printer, a stack of freshly copied documents in his hand. He understood immediately. This wasn't about a dramatic courtroom-style reveal. This was about something quieter and far more powerful. A whispering campaign, he said with a solemn nod. We build the army before we declare war. They made a list, not of the loudest complainers, but of the quiet, respected residents, the people who, like Marcus, preferred peace but valued fairness more. They needed pillars, not loudspeakers. Their first visit was to David and Sarah Miller. The Millers lived 4 houses down, a middle-aged couple, he an accountant, she a school nurse. They were the kind of neighbors who always waved and kept their lawn immaculate. They were, in a word, conflict-averse. When Marcus and Javi sat in their meticulously clean living room, Marcus didn't begin with accusations. He began with a question, his tone gentle. Have you ever felt the rules here were a little inconsistent? David exchanged a long look with his wife. He then told them, in a hushed voice, about the formal notice he'd received a few months back. an order to repaint his garage door. The approved color in the HOA handbook was desert tan. His was harvest beige. The one shade difference, he was told in a letter signed by Eleanor, was a serious violation that affected the harmonious visual landscape of the street. He'd spent a weekend repainting it, just to avoid trouble. Marcus listened patiently, nodding, before sliding a copy of the trust agreement across their polished coffee table. David put on his reading glasses and read it, his face slowly hardening from confusion to a quiet, simmering anger. It was the anger of a man who plays by the rules, only to discover the game was rigged. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, traced a finger over the document and asked the crucial question, "This is unbelievable, but what can we do? For now," Marcus replied calmly, meeting her gaze, "just knowing is enough. Knowing you're not wrong." Their network grew, one quiet, front porch conversation at a time. They met with Mr. Kowalski, the widower whose morning walks were his therapy, his only connection to the wife he'd walked with for 50 years. He read the document, his eyes widening behind his thick glasses, and simply said, "It's about time. It's about damn time." They visited the Chen family, a young couple with 2 small children, who were initially hesitant, afraid of retaliation. But when they heard the Millers and Mr. Kowalski were already aware, their fear gave way to a shared sense of strength. They spoke of the $600 architect fee they'd had to pay for their children's playset. Each visit was the same, a story of a petty fine or a ridiculous demand, a quiet presentation of the truth on paper, a slow, dawning realization in the eyes of a neighbor. The power Eleanor held was not rooted in law, but in the collective, atomized silence of her neighbors. A week later, a small group of 8 people gathered secretly in Javi's living room as his kids slept upstairs. They were not an angry mob. They were an informed citizenry. There was a quiet, nervous determination in the room. Marcus stood before them and outlined the plan for the upcoming HOA meeting. No shouting, no accusations, just a simple question, and a reading from a historical document. He would be the one to stand up, the focal point. But he needed their silent support in the room. He needed them to be witnesses, not just to his words, but to Eleanor's reaction. As the meeting ended, Marcus looked at the faces around him. David Miller, the quiet accountant, Mr. Kowalski, the steadfast widower, the Chens, the protective young parents. They were different people, from different walks of life, united now by a single, simple truth they had learned in confidence. They were ready. The whispers had done their work. Now, it was time for the truth to be spoken aloud. Part 5. The Reading. The night of the HOA meeting, the air in the community hall was thick with unspoken tension. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, casting a sterile glow on the mismatched folding chairs. The room was more crowded than it had been in years. People who usually only complained on the neighborhood social media page were here in person, drawn by the whispers that had circulated like a slow-moving current through the community. Marcus sat in the 3rd row, his posture straight, his hands resting calmly on his knees. Javi and David Miller were nearby, not sitting together, but part of a constellation of quiet allies. They were scattered, anonymous faces in the crowd, but they exchanged brief, steadying glances that spoke volumes. At the front of the room, on a raised dais behind a long folding table, sat Eleanor Vance. She seemed oblivious to the electric atmosphere, or perhaps she simply chose to ignore it. She moved through the meeting's agenda with her usual brisk efficiency. The treasurer's report, delivered in a monotone by Arthur Finch, a review of 3 competing landscaping bids for the front entrance, a dry, 5-minute reminder about the proper sorting of recycling materials. She was the picture of competent, unwavering control. It was a masterful performance, a subtle reinforcement of one simple idea. This was her room, her meeting, to her community, and everything was normal. Then, she arrived at the final item on her list. "New business," she announced, her voice crisp and final, as if daring anyone to speak. Does anyone have any new business to bring before the board? A heavy silence fell over the room, thick and expectant. This was the moment. Marcus could feel the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes on him. He could feel their expectation, their fear, to their hope. He took a slow, deliberate breath, held it, and then let it out. Then he stood, every head turned in a single, unified motion. Eleanor looked at him, and for the first time that evening, her practiced composure faltered for just a fraction of a second. A flicker of genuine annoyance crossed her face before being smoothed over by a thin, condescending smile. "Ah, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dripping with a false, sugary patience. "I imagine this has something to do with your fishing citation." The question was designed to belittle him, to frame his challenge as a petty, personal grievance. The room was silent, waiting for the confrontation, but Marcus did not take the bait. His voice, when it came, was not angry. It was not loud. It was the calm, measured voice of a teacher standing before his class. "Not exactly. Mrs. Vance," he said, holding her gaze without aggression. "I just have a question regarding a public document of historical significance to our community." From the inside pocket of his jacket, he pulled a single, neatly folded sheet of paper. "A copy. I'd like, with the board's permission, to read a brief passage from the founding legal document of Sunny Creek Estates. The Serenity Lake Community Trust Agreement, dated June 15th, 1972. A murmur, a collective intake of breath, rippled through the crowd. The words trust agreement were unfamiliar, foreign. Eleanor's smile vanished completely. Her posture, already straight, became rigid. She did not grant permission, but crucially, she did not deny it either. Her shock had created a vacuum, and her silence was his opening. Marcus did not look at Eleanor again. His audience was his neighbors. He looked at the Millers, at Mr. Kowalski, at the Chens, and at the dozen other faces now turned toward him with rapt attention. Then he began to read. He read slowly, his voice clear and steady, letting each word land with its own distinct weight in the quiet room. He spoke of the grantor, the beneficiaries, the irrevocable trust. He paused. Then read the most important passage of all, the one he had memorized. The Homeowners Association, hereafter referred to as the trustee, shall have the sole duty to maintain and preserve said property for the benefit of the beneficiaries. He paused again, letting the words sink in, creating a space for understanding. The right of use and enjoyment by the beneficiaries shall not be impeded, restricted, or otherwise obstructed by the trustee, outside of established state and county safety regulations. He finished reading. The room was utterly still, the hum of the lights overhead suddenly seeming deafening. The meaning of the words settled over the residents like a slow dawn, illuminating decades of darkness. They were not tenants on HOA land. They were beneficiary owners. Marcus carefully folded the paper and placed it back in his jacket pocket. He sat down. His part was done. The silence that followed was profound, deeper than before. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of unquestioned rules, of petty fines paid to avoid trouble, of a quiet, simmering resentment that had never had a name until now. Every eye in the room turned from him to the woman on the dais. They were waiting for an explanation, for a denial, for anything. Eleanor Vance's face was a pale, rigid mask. The confident control had evaporated, replaced by something cold and hard and brittle. She did not shout. She did not argue. She simply stared at Marcus. Her pale blue eyes narrowed into slits of ice. Her silence was more terrifying than any outburst. It was the silence of a queen whose castle walls had just crumbled around her, revealing her to be just an ordinary woman in a room full of people who now knew the truth. Finally, she picked up her gavel. Her hand, for the first time anyone could remember, was trembling slightly. She brought it down on the wooden block with a sharp, violent crack that made everyone flinch. "This meeting," she said, her voice tight and strained, fighting for a control that was already lost. is adjourned, without another word. She gathered her papers with stiff, jerky movements and swept out of the room through a side door, leaving behind a community drowning in the light of the truth, and a silent, unspoken threat hanging in the air like smoke. Part 6. The Unraveling. In the days following the meeting, Eleanor Vance's empire did not collapse in a thunderous explosion. It began to unravel, thread by thread, in a quiet, spreading wave of peaceful defiance. It started with small things, almost unnoticeable on their own, but revolutionary when viewed together. Mr. Kowalski took his morning walk along the lake path, and for the first time in years, he did so without a knot of anxiety in his stomach. The Chen family, emboldened, finally assembled the colorful cedar playset in their backyard. It stood as a bright monument to their newfound freedom, and no warning notice appeared on their door. Javi defiantly reinstalled his whimsical mushroom-shaped solar lights along his garden path. At dusk, their soft white glow felt like a small constellation of victory in the twilight. It was not chaos. It was a return to reason. People still cut their grass to a respectable height. They still brought in their trash cans on the correct day. But they did so as neighbors taking pride in their homes, not as subjects living under the constant, watchful eye of a monarch. A palpable sense of collective relief settled over Sunny Creek. The air itself felt lighter. Marcus observed these small revolutions with a quiet sense of satisfaction, but also with a historian's caution. He knew that power, when challenged so publicly, does not simply vanish. It regroups. It retreats into the shadows to seek new weapons. He knew the story wasn't over. It was merely between chapters. His unease was confirmed a week later. Arthur Finch, the HOA treasurer, appeared at his doorstep on a Tuesday afternoon. Arthur was a meticulous man in his 70s, a retired accountant who believed in the comforting certainty of rules and balanced ledgers. Today, he looked flustered, his usual neatness replaced by a worried frown that creased his forehead. "Marcus," he said, skipping the pleasantries and speaking in a low, urgent voice. "I'm concerned. Deeply concerned." He explained that Eleanor had canceled the weekly board meeting without explanation. A first in his 6 years on the board. She wasn't answering emails from him or the other board members, except for two who had always been her staunchest loyalists. She had, in effect, gone silent, creating an information vacuum. "I saw her leaving her house yesterday," Arthur whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder as if expecting to see Eleanor's golf cart appear. She was with the HOA's lawyer, Mr. Abernathy. Just the two of them. They were carrying a thick binder. When I asked her about it later, she just said it was a sensitive legal matter that required executive discretion. The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine. A sensitive legal matter. Executive discretion. Eleanor was not surrendering. She was maneuvering. She was searching the fine print of her own rulebook. The same 100-page document Javi had found so impenetrable, looking for a loophole, a forgotten clause, a different kind of weapon. Eleanor herself became a ghost in the neighborhood she once patrolled with such vigilance. The familiar hum of her golf cart was gone. She was seen only in brief, unsettling glimpses, walking from her front door to her car, her face a stony mask, her eyes fixed straight ahead, seeing nothing and no one. She offered no greetings. She acknowledged no one. Her silence was a heavy blanket smothering the community's newfound freedom. It was a calculated, unnerving absence, designed to create uncertainty and fear. The initial euphoria of the residents began to fade, replaced by a low-grade, simmering anxiety. What was she planning? The answer came late on a Thursday night. The phone rang in Marcus's quiet house, the sound jarring in the stillness. It was Arthur Finch. His voice was strained, laced with a panic he could no longer contain. "Marcus, she's done something," Arthur said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "She's called an emergency executive board meeting for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. But it's not for the whole board. The bylaws allow for a closed session for legal counsel. It's just her and the 2 members who are still loyal to her. She's locking the rest of us out." "What's the topic?" "Arthur?" Marcus asked, his own heart starting to beat faster. A cold dread creeping into his veins. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Arthur's voice, now barely a whisper, freighted with disbelief. The agenda has only one item: a review and immediate action concerning the master insurance policy, the liability coverage. For the lake, he took a shaky breath. My God. Marcus, I think she's going to burn the whole house down because she can't rule it anymore. Part 7. The Insurance Clause. The next morning, the sky a cool, indifferent blue. A small group gathered in the damp air outside the community hall. Marcus was there, Javi, David Miller, Mr. Kowalski, a few others. They had come not to protest, not to shout, but simply to bear witness. They found the main door locked. Standing before it like sentinels were the two board members loyal to Eleanor, their arms crossed, their expressions a perfect, unreadable blend of apology and defiance. This is a closed executive session, one of them stated flatly, reciting a line he had clearly been told to memorize. Board members in the session only. David Miller, the mild-mannered accountant, a man who had never raised his voice in his life, stepped forward. But we are the homeowners, the beneficiaries of the trust. The lake belongs to us. We have a right to be here when you discuss its future. The board member just shook his head, his gaze fixed on a point just over David's shoulder. Not according to Bylaw 64, Section B, regarding an executive session on matters of active legal counsel and insurance liability. The door remained locked. They were trapped. They had won the war of truth with a 50-year-old document, only to be defeated by a procedural rule buried on page 74 of the HOA handbook. All they could do was stand outside on the dew-soaked grass, helpless, occasionally catching a glimpse through the tall windows of Eleanor at the head of the table. She was speaking in low, serious tones, gesturing to a thick binder of official-looking papers in front of her. The meeting lasted for 2 hours. 2 hours of watching their fate being decided behind a locked door. The muffled sounds of discussion, a torment. When it was over, Eleanor emerged alone. She did not look at them. She walked with a stiff, deliberate purpose that felt both theatrical and chilling. She walked directly to the community bulletin board, the same oak tree where the story had ended and begun. In her hand, she held a thumbtack and a single, crisp sheet of paper, with 4 precise, forceful pushes. She pinned the new notice over a flyer for a community yard sale. Then, without a single backward glance, she walked to her car, got in, and drove away. Everyone surged forward, a knot of dread tightening in their chests. Marcus reached the board first, his eyes scanning the black, impersonal text. The language was cold, meticulously crafted, and utterly devastating. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic revenge. The notice explained, in carefully chosen legal terms, that the community's master liability insurance policy, which covered all common areas, was contingent upon the Homeowners Association's ability to enforce and actively regulate safety protocols and access. Due to the recent reinterpretation of the community's 50-year-old founding documents, which had effectively removed the HOA's authority to restrict access or enforce its own internal safety rules, the insurance company had deemed Serenity Lake an uncontrollable and unacceptable risk. Therefore, effective immediately, their policy for Serenity Lake and its surrounding parkland areas had been officially canceled by the provider. The final paragraph was the kill shot, delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon. Upon the urgent advice of our legal counsel, and to protect the HOA and all its homeowner members from catastrophic financial liability in the event of an accident. Marcus read aloud, his voice hollow. The board has no choice but to prohibit any and all recreational use of Serenity Lake and its adjacent parkland until further notice. This area is now closed. It was all there. Official, legal, final, signed. Eleanor Vance. Marcus stepped back from the board, the paper blurring before his eyes. Eleanor hadn't broken the law. She had wielded it like a weapon. She had found the one clause, the one technicality, the one thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything. She couldn't stop one man from fishing, so she had stopped everyone from doing anything at all. He looked at the faces of his neighbors around him. The hope and quiet victory of the past weeks had vanished, replaced by shock, disbelief, and a rising tide of helpless fury. Mr. Kowalski stared toward the lake, now beautiful and untouchable, its calm surface mocking them. His shoulders, which had seemed straighter these last few weeks, were now slumped in defeat. So, he said to no one in particular, his voice cracking with an old man's emotion, "We won, just to lose everything?" The question hung in the stunned silence. A perfect, bitter epitaph for their victory. Mr. Kowalski's question wasn't just for Marcus. It's for all of us. Have you ever fought for what was right, only to find that victory came with a cost you never expected? The fight for Sunny Creek has entered a new, darker chapter. If you are still listening, please help me by commenting with the number 1 below, just so I know that I still have friends journeying with me through this story. Your presence is the greatest encouragement for me to continue to the final chapter, to see if there is any light to be found after such a cruel reprisal. Part 8. The Aftermath. Eleanor's final move fractured the fragile unity of Sunny Creek Estates. The community, once united in quiet frustration against her, now turned on itself. The victory Marcus had secured felt hollow, replaced by a bitter and divisive peace. The friendly waves between neighbors became hesitant, sometimes replaced by a quick, averted gaze. The whispers returned. But this time, they were not whispers of solidarity. They were whispers of blame. One afternoon, standing by the community mailboxes, Marcus overheard a heated exchange. It was between 2 women he recognized but didn't know well. One was defending him. He stood up to her. He did what none of us had the guts to do. The other woman's voice was sharp with anger. And look what it got us. I'd rather pay a few stupid fines and let my kids use the lake than have this nothing. He should have just left it alone. The words felt like a physical blow. Marcus slipped his own mail from his box and walked away before they could see him, the accusation echoing in his ears. He should have just left it alone. A few days later, he was kneeling in his front garden, pulling weeds from around the rose bushes, when a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Denise, a neighbor from 2 streets over. He knew her only vaguely, a quiet woman who kept to herself. Today, her face was tight with a grief that had curdled into anger. "Look what you've done," she said, her voice trembling. "My son, he learned to fish on that lake with his grandfather. It was their place. My father passed away 2 years ago, and that was the one spot my boy still felt close to him." She gestured toward the closed-off parkland. "Now it's gone. Is this what your victory looks like? Mr. Thorne, are you happy now that you've proven your point?" Marcus stood up slowly, wiping the soil from his hands. There was nothing he could say to defend himself, because he understood her pain. He saw the situation through her eyes. A man she barely knew had picked a fight, and the fallout had taken something precious from her family. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't try to explain the principle. He just stood there and absorbed her anger, his own face a mask of quiet sorrow. "No, Denise," he said softly, "I'm not happy." His simple, honest answer seemed to disarm her. The anger drained from her face, leaving only weariness behind. She turned and walked away without another word. That evening, Marcus walked to the edge of the now forbidden parkland. Yellow caution tape was strung between the trees, ugly and jarring against the natural beauty. A stark, professionally printed sign read, "No trespassing." By order of the HOA board, the lake was still beautiful, its surface like dark glass in the fading light, but it now felt like a museum piece, something to be looked at but never touched. It was a silent, mocking testament to his failure. He sat on a bench just outside the tape, the weight of the community's disappointment pressing down on him. He replayed Denise's words in his head. "Are you happy now that you've proven your point? Was she right? Was a flawed, unjust peace better than a righteous, painful truth? Had he, in his quest for justice, simply traded one form of tyranny for another, the tyranny of a locked gate?" This was his darkest moment. a profound and lonely self-doubt that gnawed at his soul. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear Javi approach and sit down beside him. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "I should have seen this coming," Javi said finally, his voice heavy with guilt. "She was never going to just give up. I was naive." Marcus didn't respond at first. He just stared at the still water. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. The doubt was gone, replaced by a clarity born from his moment of despair. "This isn't our fault, Javi," he said, turning to look at his friend. "We did the right thing. The problem isn't that we won. The problem is what we do after we win." He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "Eleanor thinks this is the end. A checkmate. But she's wrong." He looked from Javi to the locked-off lake. "This is just the beginning." The words hung in the twilight. It was a shift. A transformation from a man who had reacted to an injustice into a man who was now choosing to build something new from the wreckage. Part 9. The Community Trust. A few nights later, Marcus convened a meeting in Javi's garage. The same small group of original allies was there, along with a few other residents who had reached out. Tired of the blame and ready for a solution, the mood was somber, uncertain. Marcus stood before them, not as a victorious hero, but as a fellow homeowner. "The problem was never just Eleanor," he began, his voice calm and steady. "She was a symptom. The real problem is a system that allowed one person to have so much unchecked power. Overturning the HOA won't fix that. We need to create something better to take its place, specifically for the lake." He held up his copy of the old document. The developer's original vision was the right one, a trust, governed by the people it served. "So that's what we're going to do. We are going to form a new Serenity Lake Community Trust Council, elected by us, the residents. We will take back our role as beneficiaries and manage the lake ourselves, just as the founding document intended." The idea was audacious. It was difficult, but it was also filled with hope. The whispering campaign began again, but this time, the whispers were not of secrets and injustices. They were whispers of a new beginning. Marcus, Javi, David Miller, and others went door to door. They didn't just carry the story of Eleanor's overreach, they carried a plan, a detailed proposal for a new council, a budget for a new, independent insurance policy, funded by a small, voluntary annual fee from each household, a timeline for an open and transparent election. They met with skepticism. They met with weariness. Many people, like Denise, were too hurt to trust in a new plan. But for every door that closed, another opened with cautious optimism. The logic of the plan was sound, and the passion of its proponents was genuine. Slowly, painstakingly, a majority began to form. Eleanor, seeing her authority being rendered completely irrelevant, made one last stand. Letters from the HOA's lawyer arrived in the mailboxes of the organizing committee members, including Marcus and Javi. The letters were filled with threats, warning of personal liability and unsanctioned governance. It was a final, desperate attempt to intimidate them into silence. But this time, the community was not afraid. A young lawyer who lived on the next street over offered his services pro bono, drafting a response that politely but firmly cited the original trust document and the residents' rights as beneficiaries. Eleanor's threats were rendered powerless by the very truth Marcus had uncovered. A few months later, on a bright Saturday morning, the yellow caution tape came down. The newly elected Serenity Lake Community Trust Council, a 5-member board of residents that included David Miller as its treasurer, had secured a new insurance policy. Their first official act was to reopen the lake to the community. The final scene of the story found Marcus Thorne standing by the water's edge. He wasn't fishing. He was just watching. He watched the Chen children paddle a small kayak near the shore. He saw Mr. Kowalski walking the path, a small, peaceful smile on his face. He saw Javi and his family spreading a picnic blanket on the grass. Eleanor Vance still lived in Sunny Creek. She was still, technically, the HOA president, but her power was gone. She had become invisible, a ghost of a forgotten regime. The residents had learned that true authority didn't come from a rulebook or a title. It came from shared responsibility and mutual trust. Marcus Thorne had started this journey, wanting nothing more than a quiet morning of fishing. In the end, he had gotten it, not by winning a fight, but by helping his entire neighborhood learn how to trust itself again. And that, he realized, was the only kind of victory that truly mattered. In the end, this was never just about a fishing fine or a lake. It was about the quiet courage it takes to question a system, and the difficult truth that winning isn't always the end of the fight. Marcus Thorne's journey reminds us that true change happens not when one person stands up, but when a community learns to stand together. We're curious to know what part of this story stayed with you the most. Please feel free to share your reflections below. And if you'd like to explore more stories that search for the deeper truths, we warmly invite you to subscribe to Deepu Cater Stories. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being a part of this community.